In 1955, three young Navajo sisters vanished without a trace from St. Jude's Home of Hope, leaving behind only whispers of escape and official silence. 20 years later, their brother Kaya receives an anonymous letter with 4 chilling words: The secret of the bell tower. What he discovers beneath the abandoned orphanage will shatter everything he thought he knew about faith, family, and the institutions meant to protect the innocent. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The autumn rain drummed against the weathered windows of Kaya Yabazi's modest apartment in Albuquerque, each droplet carrying 20 years of accumulated grief. In 1975, the Vietnam veteran sat hunched over his kitchen table, surrounded by the detritus of an obsession that had consumed 2 decades of his life. Newspaper clippings yellowed with age were meticulously organized in manila folders, their edges worn from countless readings. Police reports, witness statements, and correspondence with government officials formed neat stacks that spoke of a methodical mind refusing to surrender to despair. Kaya's weathered hands, scarred from jungle warfare and endless nights of investigation, trembled slightly as he reached for his morning coffee. The bitter brew had grown cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. His dark eyes, framed by premature lines that spoke of sleepless nights and relentless searching, remained fixed on the single photograph that had anchored his sanity for 2 decades. The black and white image, its edges cracked and fading, showed 3 young Navajo girls standing in front of the imposing stone building. Zola, the eldest at 12, stood protectively between her younger sisters Kiona, 10, and little Anya, barely 8. Their traditional braids caught the photographer's flash, and their eyes held a mixture of uncertainty and hope that now seemed heartbreakingly naive. Behind the children, the saint, Jude's Home of Hope rose like a Gothic monument to misplaced faith. Its limestone facade was adorned with religious symbols that promised salvation, but delivered only sorrow. And there, positioned with calculated benevolence, stood Reverend Alistair Cole. His pale hand rested on Zola's shoulder, with what appeared to be paternal kindness, but Kaya had stared at that gesture so long that it now seemed predatory, possessive. The Reverend's smile was perfect for the camera, his silver hair immaculately styled, his clerical collar pristine white against his black cassock. Everything about the man radiated respectability and divine purpose. The official story had been simple, almost insulting in its brevity. On a cold November morning in 1955, the 3 Yabazi sisters had simply vanished. Their beds were found empty, their few possessions left behind. The authorities concluded they had run away, perhaps attempting to return to the reservation. Search parties combed the surrounding desert for weeks, but no trace of the girls was ever found. The case was quietly closed, filed away with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized the treatment of missing Native American children. But Kaya had never believed it. Even as a 15-year-old boy, grieving the loss of his sisters and watching his parents slowly die from heartbreak, he had sensed the falseness in the official narrative. Zola had been the responsible one, fiercely protective of her younger siblings. She would never have led them into the harsh desert without preparation or destination. Kiona had been afraid of the dark, clinging to her sister's hand during thunderstorms. And Anya, sweet Anya, had been too young to understand the concept of running away from anything except immediate fear. The years that followed had been a blur of military service and single-minded determination. Kaya had enlisted as soon as he was old enough, hoping the structure and purpose of military life would provide direction for his grief. Instead, the jungles of Vietnam had taught him patience, tactical thinking, and the understanding that truth was often the first casualty of any conflict. He had returned home a decorated veteran, but the medals and commendations felt hollow compared to the weight of his sister's absence. Every spare moment of his civilian life had been devoted to the search. He had interviewed former staff members of St. Jude's, most of whom had scattered like leaves after the institution's mysterious closure in 1956. Those who agreed to speak offered only fragments of memory. The Reverend's strict discipline, the children's frightened whispers, the way certain children seemed to disappear without explanation. Several mentioned strange nighttime activities and visitors who came after dark, but their accounts were vague, shadowed by fear and the passage of time. Kaya had pestered local law enforcement, state officials, and federal agencies with the tenacity of a man who had nothing left to lose. He had learned to navigate bureaucratic mazes, to file Freedom of Information Act requests, and to pressure politicians during election seasons. Some officials had been sympathetic, others dismissive, but none had been able to provide the answers he desperately sought. The trail had grown colder with each passing year, but Kaya's determination had only intensified. The apartment around him bore testament to his unwavering focus. Maps of New Mexico covered one wall, marked with red pins indicating locations where he had searched or interviewed potential witnesses. A bulletin board displayed photographs of St. Jude's Home of Hope from various angles and time periods, creating a visual timeline of the institution's brief but impactful existence. Boxes of documents lined the hallway, each carefully labeled and cross-referenced. Friends and fellow veterans had long since stopped suggesting that he move on, that he find peace in acceptance. On this particular October morning, the familiar routine of reviewing evidence and planning new investigative approaches was interrupted by the soft thud of mail falling through the slot in his front door. Kaya glanced at his watch, noting that the postal delivery was earlier than usual. He pushed back from the table, his joints protesting after hours in the same position, and walked to the small pile of envelopes scattered on the worn linoleum. Bills and advertisements comprised the usual assortment, but one envelope immediately commanded his attention. It bore no return address, and his name was written in a handwriting that seemed to tremble with either urgency or fear. The paper was cheap, the kind available at any general store, and the postmark was smudged beyond legibility. Kaya's pulse quickened as he recognized the significance of anonymity in his long investigation. Very few people were willing to attach their names to information about St. Jude's Home of Hope. He carried the envelope back to his kitchen table, setting it down next to the photograph of his sisters. For a moment, he simply stared at it, as if the paper itself might reveal its secrets without being opened. 20 years of disappointments had taught him to temper his expectations. But something about this particular correspondence felt different. Perhaps it was the nervous energy of the handwriting, or the way the sender had taken pains to obscure their identity. But Kaya sensed that this letter might contain the breakthrough he had been seeking for 2 decades. With careful precision, he opened the envelope using a knife from his kitchen drawer. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The message was brief, consisting of only 2 sentences written in the same shaky handwriting. The secret of the bell tower. He won't like you knowing. Below the words, someone had drawn a crude symbol that might have been a bird, or simply nervous scribbling. Kaya read the message 3 times, his mind racing to decode its meaning. The bell tower clearly referenced St. Jude's Home of Hope, which had indeed featured a prominent bell tower that had been visible for miles across the desert landscape. But what secret could be hidden there after all these years? The building had been abandoned since the institution's closure, left to the mercy of weather and vandals. He had explored the ruins several times over the years, finding nothing but empty rooms and faded religious murals. The second sentence was even more intriguing. He won't like you knowing. The pronoun clearly referred to someone specific, someone who was still alive and still had reason to fear exposure. Kaya's thoughts immediately turned to Reverend Alistair Cole, who had disappeared as mysteriously as the children in his care. Various sources had suggested the man was dead, but no death certificate or obituary had ever been found. Could the Reverend still be alive? And if so, what was he hiding? The anonymous letter represented the first new lead in Kaya's investigation in over 5 years. He felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the same sensation that had sustained him through countless disappointments and dead ends. Someone out there knew something about his sister's fate, and they had taken the considerable risk of contacting him. The fact that they had chosen to remain anonymous suggested genuine fear, which in turn implied that whatever they knew was significant enough to warrant caution. Kaya carefully placed the letter in a plastic sleeve, treating it with the same reverence he had shown the photograph of his sisters. This single sheet of paper represented hope, the possibility that his 20-year quest might finally yield answers. The weight of 2 decades seemed to shift slightly, transforming from the burden of grief into the anticipation of revelation. Somewhere in the ruins of St. Jude's Home of Hope, in the shadow of its crumbling bell tower, lay the truth about Zola, Kiona, and Anya. The autumn rain continued to fall against his windows, but Kaya no longer heard it. His mind was already racing ahead, planning his return to the abandoned institution. This time, he would not be searching blindly through empty rooms and collapsed hallways. This time, he had direction, purpose, and the first real clue he had received in 20 years. The secret of the bell tower was waiting to be discovered, and Kaya Yabaji was finally ready to uncover it. The drive to St. Jude's Home of Hope took Kaya through landscapes that had haunted his dreams for 20 years. His weathered pickup truck navigated the winding desert roads with mechanical precision, but his heart raced with each familiar landmark that brought him closer to the ruins of his past. The October sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the red earth that seemed to reach toward him like grasping fingers. Sagebrush and juniper trees dotted the rolling hills, their twisted forms creating an almost biblical tableau of desolation and endurance. As he crested the final hill, the skeletal remains of the institution emerged from the desert, like the bones of some ancient beast. St. Jude's Home of Hope had once stood as a monument to Christian charity, its limestone walls gleaming white against the stark landscape. Now, 20 years after its mysterious closure, nature had begun the slow process of reclamation. Thick ropes of ivy strangled the building's facade, their tendrils creeping through broken windows and cracked mortar. The once pristine religious symbols carved into the stone had been weathered into abstract shapes, their meaning obscured by decades of wind and rain. The bell tower, which had dominated the skyline for miles in every direction, now stood like a broken finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. Its copper bell had long since been stolen or fallen, leaving only an empty arch that framed patches of desert sky. Windows that had once glowed with warm light now stared blindly across the wasteland, their glass either shattered or so thick with dust that they appeared opaque. The overall effect was profoundly unsettling, as if the building itself bore witness to unspeakable secrets that had died with its abandonment. Kaya parked his truck near the main entrance, where weeds had pushed through cracks in the circular driveway. The silence that enveloped the ruins was absolute and oppressive, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. This was not the peaceful quiet of a desert afternoon, but something heavier, more ominous. It was the silence of a place where children's laughter had been systematically silenced, where hope had been methodically crushed beneath the weight of institutional cruelty. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the echoes of long-forgotten screams and whispered prayers that had gone unanswered. As Kaya stepped from his vehicle, his boots crunched on gravel mixed with broken glass and debris. The familiar weight of grief settled across his shoulders like an old coat, bringing with it the faces of Zola, Kiona, and Anya. He could almost see them as they had been in that final photograph, their dark eyes bright with the naive trust that had ultimately betrayed them. The knowledge that they had walked these same paths, breathed this same air, and experienced whatever horrors had befallen them within these walls, made every step feel like a pilgrimage through his own personal hell. The main building stretched before him in a series of interconnected wings, each one serving a different function in the institution's daily operations. Administrative offices occupied the central structure, flanked by dormitories, classrooms, and common areas. Behind the main complex, barely visible through the encroaching vegetation, stood the chapel where Reverend Cole had delivered his sermons to captive audiences of displaced children. Every surface bore the scars of abandonment, peeling paint, rusted fixtures, and the brown stains of water damage that mapped the building's slow decay. Kaya had explored these ruins multiple times over the years, always hoping to discover some overlooked clue that might illuminate his sister's fate. Each visit had yielded nothing but frustration and deepening despair, as if the building itself were conspiring to keep its secrets buried. Today felt different, however. The anonymous letter had given him a specific target: the bell tower, and whatever secret it might contain. For the first time in years, he approached the ruins with a sense of purpose rather than blind desperation. As he made his way toward the tower's base, Kaya noticed movement near the chapel's side entrance. His military training immediately heightened his awareness, and he instinctively moved into the shadows cast by a collapsed section of wall. Through gaps in the ivy, he observed a figure examining something in their hands with intense concentration. The stranger appeared to be a man in his 30s, tall and lean with auburn hair that caught the afternoon light. He wore khaki field clothes and sturdy hiking boots, the practical attire of someone accustomed to outdoor research. What captured Kaya's attention most intensely was the document the stranger held. An aged map or blueprint that he periodically consulted while examining the building's architecture. The paper appeared to be an original or high-quality reproduction, suggesting serious research rather than casual exploration. Few people would venture to this remote location armed with historical documents, unless they had specific reasons for being there. The coincidence of finding another investigator at St. Jude's on the same day Kaya had received his anonymous tip seemed too significant to ignore. Kaya's initial instinct was suspicion. 20 years of fruitless investigation had made him wary of anyone showing sudden interest in the abandoned institution. Too many of his leads had proven to be dead ends, or, worse, deliberate misdirections designed to waste his time and energy. The timing of this stranger's presence raised immediate questions. Was this person connected to whoever had sent the anonymous letter? Were they an ally offering assistance, or an enemy attempting to interfere with his investigation? The stranger moved with methodical precision around the building's perimeter, occasionally stopping to make notes in a leather journal. His behavior suggested academic research rather than casual curiosity or malicious intent. He photographed architectural details, measured distances between structures, and cross-referenced everything with his historical map. This level of systematic documentation indicated serious scholarship and a genuine interest in understanding the institution's layout and function. Despite his wariness, Kaya found himself intrigued by the possibility that someone else was pursuing the same truth he had sought for 2 decades. The stranger's professional approach and obvious preparation suggested access to resources and information that might complement Kaya's own extensive research. Perhaps this unexpected encounter represented the breakthrough he had been seeking, a chance to combine different investigative approaches and finally penetrate the wall of silence surrounding St. Jude's dark history. After several minutes of observation, Kaya made the decision to reveal himself. He stepped from the shadows and approached the stranger with the cautious gait of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. His hand instinctively moved toward the knife he carried, not from aggressive intent, but from the ingrained habits of survival that had served him well in Vietnam and throughout his solitary investigation. The stranger looked up from his map with startled blue eyes that quickly assessed Kaya's approach. There was intelligence in that gaze, along with a hint of nervousness that suggested he understood the potential dangers of exploring St. Jude's alone. His grip tightened slightly on his research materials, but he made no move to flee or defend himself. Instead, he seemed to be evaluating whether Kaya represented a threat or an opportunity. Both men stood in the shadow of the bell tower, each sizing up the other's intentions and motivations. The tension between them was palpable, charged with the weight of unspoken questions and mutual uncertainty. Kaya's weathered face bore the lines of 20 years' obsession, while the stranger's younger features reflected the earnest determination of academic pursuit. They were separated by age, background, and methodology, but united by their presence in this desolate place where children had once vanished without trace. The stranger introduced himself as Liam O'Connell, a historian from the University of New Mexico, specializing in the treatment of indigenous children in religious institutions. His research had led him to St. Jude's as part of a broader investigation into patterns of disappearances among Native American children during the 1950s. The map in his hands was an original blueprint of the institution, obtained through months of archival research and bureaucratic persistence. His academic credentials and obvious sincerity began to erode Kaya's initial suspicion. Liam explained that his investigation had uncovered disturbing patterns in the historical record. Multiple religious institutions throughout the Southwest had reported unusually high rates of children running away or being transferred to other facilities during the same time period. The official explanations had been accepted without serious investigation, but Liam's systematic analysis revealed statistical anomalies that suggested a more sinister reality. St. Jude's Home of Hope had exhibited the most extreme pattern of disappearances, with over 30 children vanishing during its brief operational period. The historian's research had also uncovered local legends and folklore surrounding the institution. Native communities in the region had long whispered about the bell tower and its supposed connection to the children's disappearances. According to these oral traditions, the tower had been used for purposes far beyond its ostensible religious function. Some stories spoke of strange lights visible from its windows after midnight, while others mentioned the sounds of children crying that seemed to emanate from its stone walls long after the institution's closure. As Liam shared his findings, Kaya felt a mixture of vindication and excitement. Here was independent confirmation of his long-held suspicions, presented with academic rigor and supported by documentary evidence. The historian's systematic approach had uncovered patterns that Kaya's emotional investment might have obscured, while Kaya's personal connection to the tragedy provided the human dimension that gave urgency to Liam's abstract research. The convergence of their separate investigations at this specific moment and location felt almost supernatural in its timing. Kaya's anonymous letter had directed him to the bell tower's secret, while Liam's research had identified the same structure as central to the institution's dark activities. Their different methodologies and motivations had led them to the same conclusion: the truth about St. Jude's Home of Hope lay hidden within the crumbling walls of its most prominent architectural feature. Standing together in the shadow of the tower, both men felt the weight of history pressing down upon them. The silence that had protected the institution's secrets for 20 years seemed to tremble on the verge of breaking. Somewhere within the stone walls above them lay answers that had eluded investigators, journalists, and family members for 2 decades. The bell tower, which had once called children to prayer, now beckoned 2 determined men toward a truth that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. The blueprint spread across the crumbling stone foundation of the bell tower, like a roadmap to buried secrets. Liam's weathered hands smoothed the edges of the architectural drawing, while Kaya knelt beside him, their heads bent together in focused concentration. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tower's empty window frames, creating a natural spotlight on the document that seemed almost providential. Every line and measurement on the blueprint had been meticulously preserved despite decades of storage, the ink still dark against the yellowed paper that bore the official seal of the diocese that had commissioned St. Jude's construction. According to the blueprint, the bell tower's foundation extended far deeper into the earth than what was visible from ground level. The architectural drawings revealed a complex system of support structures, storage chambers, and what appeared to be maintenance tunnels that connected the tower to the main building. Most intriguingly, the plans showed a secondary foundation level that had no apparent access point from the main structure, suggesting it had been designed for purposes that required absolute privacy and discretion. Kaya's pulse quickened as he traced the blueprint's lines with his finger, following the underground chambers that seemed to form a hidden network beneath the entire institution. His military experience had taught him to read tactical maps and architectural drawings, skills that now proved invaluable in deciphering the tower's mysterious construction. The design was far more elaborate than necessary for a simple religious structure, incorporating features that suggested the builders had anticipated the need for concealment and security. The legend that Liam had collected from local Native American communities suddenly took on new significance in light of the blueprint's revelations. Stories passed down through generations spoke of children who had entered the bell tower but never emerged, of strange ceremonies conducted in chambers beneath the earth, and of wealthy visitors who arrived under cover of darkness to participate in activities that the tribal elders would only describe in whispers. What had once seemed like folklore now appeared to be eyewitness accounts of actual events. Working methodically, the 2 men began examining every stone in the tower's foundation, searching for any irregularity that might indicate a hidden entrance. The limestone blocks had been carefully fitted together with mortar that had hardened over decades, creating what appeared to be an impenetrable barrier. However, the blueprint suggested that one section of the foundation should contain an access point, disguised to appear identical to the surrounding stonework, but designed to be movable by those who knew its secret. Kaya's fingers traced the rough surface of each stone, feeling for any give or movement that might indicate a concealed mechanism. The work was painstaking and physically demanding, requiring him to crawl along the foundation's perimeter while pressing and probing each individual block. His knees ached against the rocky ground, and his back protested the awkward positions necessary to examine the lower sections of the wall. But 20 years of searching had taught him the patience required for thorough investigation. Liam worked on the opposite side of the tower, his academic training lending itself to systematic analysis rather than intuitive searching. He measured distances according to the blueprint, calculated angles, and cross-referenced architectural features with historical photographs of the institution. His methodical approach complemented Kaya's more instinctive investigation, creating a comprehensive examination that left no stone unexamined or theory untested. The sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, when Kaya's fingers detected something different about one particular limestone block. Unlike its neighbors, this stone moved slightly when pressure was applied, shifting just enough to suggest that it was not permanently mortared in place. The block was positioned at ground level, partially concealed by decades of accumulated debris and the gnarled roots of desert vegetation that had grown over the foundation. Excitement and trepidation warred in Kaya's chest as he called Liam over to examine his discovery. Together, they cleared away the accumulated dirt, dead leaves, and stubborn weeds that had hidden the stone's edges. Beneath the natural camouflage, they could see that this particular block had been cut and fitted with extraordinary precision, its edges so perfectly matched to the surrounding stones that the seam was barely visible even upon close inspection. The stone proved to be far heavier than its size suggested, requiring both men to coordinate their efforts to move it. Their hands found purchase on the rough limestone surface, their muscles straining against the dead weight of rock and mortar that had remained undisturbed for 20 years. Slowly, with grunting effort and careful positioning, they managed to slide the stone aside, revealing the dark mouth of a passage that descended into the earth at a steep angle. Cool air rushed up from the opening, carrying with it the musty smell of enclosed spaces, and something else that made both men pause. A faint, sweet odor that neither could immediately identify, but that triggered primitive alarm responses deep in their minds. The passage itself was barely wide enough to accommodate a single person, its walls lined with the same limestone blocks that formed the tower's foundation. Rough-hewn steps had been carved into the rock, disappearing into darkness that their eyes could not penetrate. Liam retrieved a powerful flashlight from his research kit, its beam cutting through the subterranean blackness to reveal the passage's full extent. The stairs descended at least 20 feet before leveling into what appeared to be a horizontal tunnel. The construction was professional and permanent, clearly intended for regular use rather than emergency access. Whoever had built this hidden entrance had invested considerable time, money, and expertise in its creation. Kaya felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared into the passage that might finally provide answers to questions that had tormented him for 2 decades. Every instinct screamed warnings about descending into the unknown depths beneath St. Jude's, but the possibility of finding evidence about his sister's fate overrode any consideration of personal safety. This passage represented the first tangible progress in his investigation since receiving the anonymous letter, and he would not let fear prevent him from following the trail to its conclusion. The descent began with Kaya leading, his military experience making him the natural choice for point position in potentially dangerous terrain. The flashlight beam danced ahead of them, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the rough stone walls. Each step downward felt like a journey backward in time, taking them deeper into the buried history of St. Jude's Home of Hope, and closer to whatever secrets the institution's founders had gone to such lengths to conceal. The air grew colder with each step, and their breathing became visible in small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the narrow confines of the passage. The walls seemed to press closer together as they descended, creating a sense of claustrophobia that made both men acutely aware of the tons of earth and stone above their heads. The silence was absolute, except for their carefully placed footsteps and the sound of their increasingly rapid breathing. Halfway down the stairs, Liam's flashlight beam illuminated something that made both men freeze in their tracks. Scratched into the limestone wall were crude markings that appeared to be children's drawings. Stick figures, animals, and symbols that looked almost like desperate attempts at communication. The scratches were shallow, but clearly deliberate, carved with fingernails or small stones by hands that had nothing else available for the task. Kaya's throat constricted as he recognized the primitive artistry of captive children, their innocent attempts to leave some record of their presence in this hidden place. The drawings were scattered along the wall at varying heights, suggesting they had been created by children of different ages over an extended period of time. Some of the markings appeared to be attempts at writing, though the letters were too crude, and the light too dim for easy interpretation. The emotional impact of these desperate messages from the past threatened to overwhelm Kaya's carefully maintained composure. For 20 years, he had wondered about his sister's final moments, imagining scenarios that ranged from quick escape to prolonged suffering. Now he was confronted with physical evidence that children had been brought to this hidden place. Children who had possessed enough consciousness and hope to attempt communication with an unknown future that might someday discover their plight. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a wider tunnel that stretched beyond the reach of their flashlight beam. The construction here was even more sophisticated, with arched ceilings and carefully fitted stonework that spoke of significant financial investment and professional craftsmanship. This was not the hasty work of desperate criminals, but the methodical construction of individuals with resources, planning, and long-term intentions. The tunnel floor was covered with a thin layer of dust that showed no recent disturbance, suggesting that whatever activities had once taken place here had ended decades ago. However, the preservation was remarkable, with no signs of water damage or structural collapse that might have destroyed evidence of the tunnel's original purpose. The dry desert climate had created perfect conditions for the preservation of whatever secrets lay ahead. As they moved deeper into the underground complex, the beam of Liam's flashlight began to reveal the tunnel's destination. Ahead, barely visible in the shifting circle of light, stood what appeared to be a heavy door or barrier. The structure was clearly different from the rough limestone walls that surrounded it, appearing to be made of metal rather than stone. As they approached, the flashlight revealed the unmistakable outline of a vault door, its iron surface green with patina but still intact after decades of abandonment. Beside the vault door, positioned as if someone had dropped it in haste or desperation, lay a leather-bound book. The volume was thick and substantial, its cover darkened with age and wear, but still recognizably a diary or journal. The leather binding had cracked in places, allowing glimpses of yellowed pages filled with handwritten text that promised to finally illuminate the darkness that had surrounded St. Jude's Home of Hope for 20 years. Kaya's hands trembled as he reached for the diary, his fingers barely able to grasp the leather cover through the combination of excitement and terror that coursed through his system. This small book, abandoned in the depths beneath the bell tower, might contain the answers he had sought through 2 decades of investigation. Within its pages could lie the truth about Zola, Kiona, and Anya, the explanation for their disappearance, and perhaps even information about what had happened to the dozens of other children who had vanished from St. Jude's care. The vault door loomed above them, its iron surface seeming to pulse with malevolent energy in the shifting flashlight beam. Whatever lay beyond that barrier had been deemed important enough to hide beneath tons of stone and earth, to protect behind steel and secrecy. The diary at their feet represented the key to understanding not just the door's contents, but the entire conspiracy that had masqueraded as Christian charity while consuming the lives of innocent children. The leather diary felt impossibly heavy in Kaya's trembling hands, as if the weight of accumulated secrets had given it physical mass beyond its simple construction of paper and binding. The cover was worn smooth by decades of abandonment, its original brown color faded to a mottled pattern of tan and gray that spoke of years spent in the underground darkness. Brass corners that had once gleamed with ecclesiastical dignity were now green with verdigris, and the leather strap that had once secured the diary's contents had long since rotted away, leaving only corroded metal buckles as evidence of its former existence. Liam positioned the flashlight to create the most stable beam possible, his hands fighting against the involuntary tremors that excitement and apprehension had triggered in his nervous system. The circle of light wavered slightly with each beat of his heart, creating an almost hypnotic effect as shadows danced across the diary's weathered surface. In the confined space of the underground tunnel, the beam seemed unnaturally bright, illuminating every crack and stain on the ancient leather, while leaving the surrounding darkness impenetrable and threatening. As Kaya carefully opened the diary, the spine creaked with the dry protest of leather that had not been disturbed for decades. The sound echoed in the narrow tunnel like the whisper of long-dead voices, adding an almost supernatural quality to the moment of revelation. The first page revealed handwriting in faded brown ink, the careful script of someone educated in penmanship, but writing under conditions of obvious emotional distress. The letters trembled with the same nervous energy that had characterized the anonymous letter, suggesting a connection between this ancient confession and the recent communication that had brought Kaya to this moment. The diary's author identified herself as Sister Margaret Teresa O'Brien, a young nun who had arrived at St. Jude's Home of Hope in 1954 with genuine intentions of serving God through caring for displaced children. Her initial entries radiated the optimism and dedication of someone who believed she was participating in divine work, describing her excitement at being assigned to such an important mission and her eagerness to provide maternal care to children who had been separated from their families. The early pages painted a picture of an idealistic young woman who saw her posting as an opportunity to live out her faith through practical service. However, as Kaya turned the pages with reverent care, Sister Margaret's tone began to shift from enthusiasm to confusion, then to growing horror as she discovered the true nature of the institution where she had pledged to serve. Her handwriting became more erratic, the careful script deteriorating into desperate scrawl as she documented activities that violated every principle of her religious training and personal morality. The diary transformed from a record of missionary work into a chronicle of systematic abuse disguised as Christian charity. The sisters' first concerns centered around Reverend Cole's unusual interest in maintaining detailed records of every child's background, physical characteristics, and family history. What had initially seemed like thorough pastoral care revealed itself as something far more sinister when she discovered that these profiles were being shared with wealthy benefactors who visited the institution under cover of darkness. These nocturnal visitors were not random philanthropists, but carefully selected individuals who had specific requirements for the children they wished to acquire, through what the Reverend euphemistically called divine placement. Sister Margaret's growing unease crystallized into absolute horror when she witnessed her first adoption ceremony. The ritual took place in a hidden chamber beneath the bell tower, the same chamber where Kaya and Liam now stood reading her testimony. The ceremony bore no resemblance to legitimate adoption procedures, instead incorporating elements of religious theater designed to convince the children that they were being blessed by divine intervention rather than sold to the highest bidder. Reverend Cole presided over these proceedings dressed in elaborate vestments, surrounded by candles and religious iconography that transformed commercial transactions into pseudo-sacred rites. The diary revealed that children were categorized according to their compliance and marketability. Those who adapted quickly to institutional life and displayed the submissive behavior desired by prospective buyers were groomed for divine placement with wealthy families who paid substantial sums for the privilege of acquiring children, without the oversight and legal complications of legitimate adoption procedures. These transactions were conducted with the same business-like efficiency that characterized any commercial enterprise, complete with contracts, payment schedules, and guarantees regarding the children's health and behavior. More disturbing were the entries describing children who failed to conform to the institution's expectations, or who proved difficult to control. Sister Margaret wrote in increasingly frantic handwriting about children who were subjected to what Reverend Cole called spiritual purification, but which she recognized as systematic psychological and physical abuse. These children were confined in the underground chambers, forced to participate in bizarre rituals designed to break their spirits and eliminate any resistance to their eventual placement with buyers who specifically requested compliant, traumatized children. As Kaya read these revelations, his hands began to shake with a rage that threatened to overwhelm his ability to continue processing the information. The clinical detachment with which Sister Margaret described the institution's operations only intensified the horror of her revelations. Children were not seen as individuals with inherent worth and dignity, but as commodities to be processed, refined, and sold to customers with specific preferences and requirements. The religious facade served not to protect the children, but to provide cover for activities that would have been immediately recognized as criminal in any secular context. The sister's entries became increasingly desperate as she described her attempts to protect the children under her care while avoiding detection by Reverend Cole and his network of complicit staff members. She had tried to document evidence of abuse, to contact authorities outside the institution, and to help individual children escape, but every effort had been thwarted by the systematic corruption that pervaded every level of the operation. Local law enforcement, state officials, and even church hierarchy had been either bought off or intimidated into silence, creating an impenetrable wall of complicity that protected the institution's criminal activities. Liam watched Kaya's face in the flickering flashlight beam, seeing 20 years of anguish and uncertainty crystallize into burning fury as the truth about his sister's fate became undeniably clear. The historian had spent months researching patterns of missing children, but the clinical nature of academic investigation had insulated him from the emotional impact of individual tragedies. Now, witnessing Kaya's transformation from grieving brother to avenging angel, Liam began to understand the human cost of the historical patterns he had been documenting with scholarly detachment. The diary's most devastating revelation came in entries dated November 1955. the same month when Zola, Kiona, and Anya had officially disappeared from St. Jude's records. Sister Margaret wrote in handwriting so agitated that individual letters were barely legible, describing the arrival of 3 Navajo sisters who had been transferred from another institution after their parents' death in a car accident. The girls had been traumatized by their loss and confused by their placement in an environment so different from their cultural background, making them both vulnerable and potentially rebellious. Reverend Cole had initially attempted to place the sisters with buyers who specifically requested Native American children, but Zola's fierce protectiveness of her younger siblings had disrupted the selection process. The eldest sister had refused to be separated from Kiona and Anya, creating logistical problems for buyers who wanted only one child, or who had specific age preferences. When Zola's resistance escalated into open defiance, she was subjected to increasingly severe spiritual purification, designed to break her will and eliminate her ability to protect her sisters. Sister Margaret's entries described her horror at witnessing the systematic destruction of Zola's spirit, as the brave older sister was isolated from Kiona and Anya and subjected to psychological torture designed to convince her that resistance was futile. The young nun had attempted to intervene, but her efforts had been detected by Reverend Cole, who had threatened her with transfer to a remote mission where she would never be heard from again. Faced with the choice between personal safety and protecting the children, Sister Margaret had chosen to document the truth in her diary while searching for an opportunity to expose the institution's crimes. The final entries in the diary were dated just days before the sisters' official disappearance, written in handwriting so shattered by emotional trauma that entire sentences were illegible. Sister Margaret described a final adoption ceremony conducted in the underground chamber, where all 3 sisters were placed, with different buyers, despite Zola's desperate attempts to keep her family together. The ceremony had been particularly elaborate, incorporating elements designed to convince the children that they were being blessed by divine intervention rather than sold into lives of servitude or worse. Kaya's vision blurred with tears of rage and grief as he read Sister Margaret's description of that final ceremony. His sisters had not died quickly or peacefully, but had been systematically traumatized and separated after months of psychological torture designed to break their spirits and eliminate their cultural identity. The institution had not simply failed to protect them, but had deliberately destroyed everything that made them who they were before selling them to buyers who saw them as exotic commodities rather than human beings deserving of love and protection. The diary's conclusion revealed Sister Margaret's ultimate fate, and the reason why her testimony had remained hidden for 20 years. Her final entries described her plans to contact federal authorities and expose the institution's crimes, but the handwriting stopped abruptly in mid-sentence, suggesting that her efforts had been discovered before she could complete her mission. A loose note tucked between the diary's pages, written in different handwriting, indicated that Sister Margaret had been transferred to God's care after a sudden illness, though the circumstances described bore all the hallmarks of deliberate silencing rather than natural death. As Kaya closed the diary, the weight of 20 years of uncertainty settled into the absolute certainty of terrible knowledge. His sisters had not simply disappeared or died, but had been systematically betrayed by institutions and individuals who had claimed to act in God's name while committing crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. The religious rhetoric that had surrounded their placement at St. Jude's had been nothing more than camouflage for a commercial enterprise that traded in human suffering while hiding behind the respectability of Christian charity. The transformation in Kaya's emotional state was visible even in the dim light of the underground chamber. The desperate hope that had sustained him through 2 decades of searching had been replaced by a burning determination to ensure that justice was finally served. He was no longer simply a grieving brother seeking answers about his sister's fate, but a warrior committed to exposing and punishing those responsible for crimes that had remained hidden for far too long. The diary had provided not just answers, but a weapon that could finally be used to strike back at the network of corruption and abuse that had destroyed so many innocent lives. The diary's revelations had filled Kaya with a rage so pure and consuming that his entire body trembled with barely contained fury. His weathered hands shook as he carefully placed Sister Margaret's testament back on the dusty floor of the underground chamber, the leather-bound confession serving as both vindication of his 20-year quest and condemnation of the institutional evil that had destroyed his family. The flashlight beam wavered with his trembling, casting dancing shadows across the iron vault door that loomed before them like a gateway to hell itself. As Kaya rose from his crouched position beside the diary, something else caught his eye in the periphery of the flashlight's illumination. Partially hidden by accumulated dust and debris near the base of the vault door, lay a small object that seemed to pulse with significance in the shifting light. He moved toward it with the cautious steps of a man approaching either salvation or damnation, his military training warring with emotional desperation as he tried to maintain composure in the face of potential revelation. The object was small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, carved from dark stone with the meticulous precision that spoke of countless hours of loving craftsmanship. As Kaya's fingers closed around it, brushing away decades of accumulated dust, the unmistakable form of a bird emerged from the grime. The carving was exquisite in its detail, every feather rendered with painstaking accuracy, every curve of wing and beak polished smooth by years of handling. The stone itself was a deep gray-black color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, giving the small sculpture an almost mystical quality in the underground darkness. Recognition struck Kaya with the force of a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and sending him staggering backward against the tunnel wall. This was not just any stone bird, but a specific carving that held 20 years of memory and meaning compressed into its small form. The bird was a traditional Navajo creation, carved by their father's hands during the long winter evenings when the family had gathered around their kitchen table in the small house on the reservation. Their father had worked the stone with infinite patience, using tools passed down through generations of his family, infusing the carving with both artistic skill and spiritual significance. The stone bird had been Zola's most treasured possession, a tangible connection to their father's love and their cultural heritage. She had carried it with her constantly, clutching it during thunderstorms, rubbing its smooth surface when she felt anxious or lonely, and holding it close to her heart during the traumatic transition from their family home to the institutional environment of St. Jude's Home of Hope. Their father had told her that the bird would carry her prayers to the spirits of their ancestors, that it would provide protection and guidance whenever she felt lost or afraid. Kaya remembered with crystalline clarity the last time he had seen the carving, clutched in Zola's small fist as she stood with her sisters for that final photograph outside the orphanage. She had hidden it partially within the folds of her dress, but he had caught a glimpse of the familiar dark stone that represented everything their family had been before tragedy scattered them to the winds. The fact that the bird was here, abandoned in this underground chamber of horrors, served as undeniable proof that Zola had been brought to this place, that she had experienced whatever evil had been conducted behind the vault door's iron barrier. The emotional impact of holding his sister's most precious possession threatened to shatter Kaya's composure entirely. For 20 years, he had clung to the hope that his sisters had somehow escaped their fate, that they had found safety somewhere beyond the reach of those who wished them harm. The discovery of Zola's bird in this tomb-like chamber destroyed that final refuge of optimism, replacing it with the brutal certainty that she had been here, had suffered here, and had ultimately lost even this small comfort in her final moments. Liam watched in horrified fascination as Kaya clutched the stone carving to his chest, his weathered face contorting with grief so profound that it seemed to physically age him before the historian's eyes. The academic distance that had previously protected Liam from the emotional weight of his research crumbled entirely as he witnessed the raw agony of a man confronting the ultimate confirmation of his worst fears. This was no longer a matter of historical documentation or scholarly investigation, but a deeply personal tragedy that demanded justice rather than merely understanding. The stone bird seemed to burn in Kaya's palm like a coal from the fires of hell, its familiar weight and texture serving as a bridge between his memories of family happiness and the harsh reality of institutional betrayal. He could see Zola as she had been in life, fierce and protective despite her young age, always ready to place herself between her younger sisters and any threat that might emerge from their uncertain world. The fact that she had been forced to abandon this sacred object suggested suffering so profound that even her spiritual strength had finally been overwhelmed. The discovery transformed Kaya's burning rage into something colder and more focused, a determination that transcended personal grief, to encompass a mission of justice that would honor not just his sister's memory, but the memory of every child who had suffered within St. Jude's walls. The diary had provided the documentary evidence of institutional evil, but the stone bird offered something more powerful, physical proof that connected the abstract horrors described in Sister Margaret's testimony to the specific tragedy of his family's destruction. Together, Kaya and Liam made their way back through the underground tunnel, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the confined space as they carried the weight of terrible knowledge toward the surface world. The climb up the stone steps felt like emerging from hell itself, each step taking them farther from the physical evidence of evil, but closer to the challenge of convincing a skeptical world that such horrors had actually occurred. The bright desert sunlight that greeted them at the tunnel's exit seemed obscenely cheerful after the revelations they had uncovered in the underground darkness. The drive to the local police station passed in grim silence, both men lost in their own thoughts as they contemplated the magnitude of what they had discovered and the challenges that lay ahead. The diary and the stone bird rested in a canvas bag between them, physical evidence of crimes that had been hidden for 20 years, but which demanded immediate action despite the passage of time. Kaya's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his mind racing between memories of his sisters and plans for ensuring that justice was finally served. The police station occupied a low, modern building on the outskirts of town, its bland architecture reflecting the bureaucratic indifference that had allowed St. Jude's crimes to remain hidden for decades. The American flag hanging limply in the still desert air seemed to mock the ideals of justice and protection that were supposed to characterize law enforcement, while the empty parking lot suggested a level of staffing that would be inadequate for investigating complex historical crimes. Chief of Police Raymond Hutchins emerged from his office with the swagger of a man accustomed to wielding authority over a small domain where his word was rarely questioned. He was a large man gone soft with middle age, his uniform stretched tight across a belly that spoke of too many hours behind a desk and too few in actual police work. His eyes held the calculating intelligence of a survivor who had learned to navigate the complex relationships between law enforcement, local politics, and the economic interests that determined policy in small desert communities. Hutchins listened to their initial explanation, with the patronizing attention of a man humoring obvious cranks, his expression shifting from polite interest to barely concealed contempt as Kaya and Liam described their discoveries beneath St. Jude's bell tower. The physical evidence they presented, the diary, the stone bird, and the photographs Liam had taken of the underground chamber, failed to penetrate the chief's wall of skepticism, which seemed rooted in something deeper than mere professional caution. As their presentation continued, subtle changes in Hutchins' demeanor revealed the true source of his resistance to their evidence. His initial dismissiveness transformed into something more aggressive and threatening, suggesting that their investigation had touched upon matters that he considered personally dangerous, rather than merely inconvenient. The casual mention of Reverend Cole's name triggered a visible tightening around the chief's eyes, a physical reaction that spoke of long-standing relationships and mutual obligations that transcended professional duty. The turning point came when Hutchins began asking pointed questions about their methods of investigation, focusing not on the evidence they had uncovered, but on their legal right to have been exploring the abandoned institution. His tone shifted from professional skepticism to overt hostility, as he suggested that they had committed criminal trespass and possibly evidence tampering by removing items from the underground chamber. The threat of prosecution hung in the air like smoke, designed to intimidate them into abandoning their pursuit of justice. Kaya's growing suspicion about the chief's motivations crystallized into certainty when Hutchins made a casual reference to his own childhood experiences as a ward of various state institutions. The comment was delivered with studied nonchalance, but its implications were devastating. The chief was not simply a corrupt official protecting powerful interests, but a potential survivor of the very system they were attempting to expose. His loyalty to Reverend Cole was not merely professional or financial, but deeply personal and psychological. The realization that they were facing not just institutional indifference, but active complicity in covering up historical crimes, struck both men with the force of betrayal. The very system that should have provided justice for the victims of St. Jude's was instead protecting their victimizers, creating an impenetrable wall of corruption that had kept the truth buried for 20 years. Chief Hutchins represented not law enforcement, but law prevention, using his badge and authority to shield criminals rather than apprehend them. As Hutchins' threats became more explicit, mentioning potential charges of breaking and entering, evidence tampering, and making false reports, Kaya felt the familiar rage building in his chest once again. 20 years of frustrated investigation had led to this moment of perfect injustice, where the truth was finally within reach, but remained protected by the same institutional corruption that had enabled the original crimes. The stone bird seemed to burn in his pocket, a reminder of his sister's suffering and the system's continued betrayal of those who had no power to fight back. The meeting ended with Hutchins escorting them from the building under threat of immediate arrest if they continued to pursue their harassment of respected community members or their vandalism of historical properties. The chief's final words carried the weight of absolute authority backed by the full power of local law enforcement, creating a situation where the pursuit of justice had been transformed into criminal activity through the simple expedient of redefining truth as slander and investigation as trespass. Standing in the parking lot outside the police station, Kaya and Liam found themselves confronting the full magnitude of the conspiracy they had uncovered. The institutional evil that had destroyed his sisters was not a thing of the past, but a living system that continued to protect itself through the corruption of every level of authority that might threaten its secrets. The diary and the stonebird were not evidence to be investigated, but crimes to be suppressed. And their discovery was not a breakthrough, but a threat to be neutralized. The desert twilight painted the small town in shades of amber and crimson as Kaya and Liam found themselves fugitives in their own pursuit of justice. The confrontation at the police station had transformed them from investigators into hunted men, their evidence dismissed and their motives criminalized by a system designed to protect the very corruption they sought to expose. The weight of Chief Hutchins' threats hung over them like a storm cloud, making every passing police cruiser a potential source of arrest and imprisonment. They had taken refuge in the shadows behind the abandoned gas station on the outskirts of town, its broken windows and rusted pumps serving as monuments to economic decline and institutional neglect. The building provided cover from the main road, while offering multiple escape routes through the desert scrubland that stretched endlessly beyond the town's borders. Kaya's military training had automatically assessed the tactical situation, identifying sight lines, cover positions, and potential extraction routes with the methodical precision that had kept him alive in Vietnam. Liam crouched beside a pile of discarded tires, his academic composure completely shattered by their transformation from researchers to criminals. His hands shook as he repeatedly checked his watch, unable to comprehend how their careful investigation had devolved into a situation that threatened not just their research, but their freedom. The historian's orderly world of archives and documentation had collided with the brutal reality of institutional corruption, leaving him psychologically unprepared for the consequences of uncovering truth that powerful people wanted buried. The canvas bag containing Sister Margaret's diary and Zola's stonebird rested between them, its contents representing both vindication and condemnation. The evidence they had risked everything to uncover now felt like contraband, physical proof of crimes that the legal system had chosen to classify as fiction rather than face the implications of institutional failure. Every piece of documentation they had carefully preserved now served as potential evidence of their own alleged criminal activity, rather than the historical atrocities they had discovered. As darkness settled over the desert landscape, the temperature began its nightly plunge from scorching heat to bone-chilling cold. The thin cotton shirt that had been adequate for the afternoon sun now provided little protection against the desert wind that carried the scent of sage and the promise of a harsh night ahead. Kaya wrapped his jacket more tightly around his shoulders, the familiar gesture triggering memories of countless nights spent in hostile territory where survival depended on remaining invisible to enemies who controlled the daylight hours. The sound of approaching vehicles on the distant highway caused both men to freeze in their concealment, hearts racing as they waited to determine whether the sounds represented routine traffic or active pursuit. Chief Hutchins had made it clear that their continued investigation would be met with arrest, but the specifics of how aggressively he would pursue them remained unclear. The chief's obvious personal investment in protecting Reverend Cole suggested that passive intimidation might escalate to active hunting if they posed a sufficient threat to whatever conspiracy had kept the truth buried for 20 years. Kaya's mind raced through their limited options as the reality of their isolation became increasingly apparent. The local authorities were compromised, state officials had shown no interest in historical crimes involving Native American children, and federal agencies had proven equally indifferent to patterns of abuse that targeted marginalized communities. Their evidence was compelling but legally obtained through methods that could be characterized as criminal trespass, creating a legal vulnerability that enemies could exploit to discredit both their findings and their motives. The solution came to Kaya with the sudden clarity of divine inspiration or desperate necessity. The Navajo Nation maintained its own police force, with jurisdiction over crimes involving tribal members regardless of where those crimes had occurred. More importantly, tribal law enforcement operated independently of the local and state authorities, who had proven themselves complicit in covering up St. Jude's atrocities. If anywhere offered hope for justice, it would be among his own people, who understood both the historical context of institutional abuse and the ongoing need to protect their children from predatory systems. The nearest payphone stood like a lonely sentinel beside the highway, its metal housing scarred by years of desert weather and the occasional frustration of users who had discovered that justice could not be purchased for the price of a local call. The booth's interior light flickered erratically, casting intermittent shadows that made the simple act of dialing seem fraught with conspiracy and danger. Kaya's fingers trembled slightly as he inserted coins into the slot, each metallic clink echoing hollowly in the confined space. Officer Teha Yazi's name had been given to Kaya years earlier by a tribal elder who had survived his own experiences in government boarding schools. The elder had spoken of her with a respect bordering on reverence, describing a law enforcement professional who had dedicated her career to protecting Native children from the institutional predators who continued to operate under various guises throughout the Southwest. Her reputation for tenacity and integrity had made her a legend within tribal law enforcement circles, where stories of her investigations had taken on almost mythical proportions. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered, with the crisp professionalism that characterized law enforcement officers trained to handle crisis situations at any hour. Officer Yazi's voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. But underneath that professional competence lay warmth and compassion that immediately distinguished her from the cold bureaucracy they had encountered at the local police station. Kaya's normally steady voice cracked slightly as he began explaining the purpose of his call. 20 years of suppressed emotion threatening to overwhelm his ability to communicate coherently. The weight of his sister's disappearance, the discovery of Sister Margaret's diary, and the corruption they had encountered at every level of authority combined into a narrative so overwhelming that he struggled to find words adequate to convey its significance. His hands gripped the phone receiver with white-knuckled intensity as he forced himself to maintain composure while describing experiences that had shattered his faith in every institution he had once trusted. The story poured out of him in a torrent of barely controlled anguish. Beginning with that November morning in 1955, when 3 young Navajo girls had vanished from St. Jude's Home of Hope, and continuing through 20 years of fruitless investigation that had finally yielded the truth buried beneath the institution's bell tower. He described Sister Margaret's diary with its horrifying revelations of systematic child trafficking disguised as Christian charity, the discovery of Zola's stone bird as physical proof of his sister's presence in the underground chamber, and the betrayal they had encountered from Chief Hutchins and the local authorities who should have protected the innocent rather than their victimizers. Officer Yazi listened to his account with the patience of someone who understood that truth often came wrapped in pain and delivered by voices shaking with decades of suppressed grief. She asked pointed questions that demonstrated both professional skepticism and genuine concern, probing for details that would help her assess the credibility of his claims while simultaneously gathering the information necessary to launch an investigation. Her questions revealed extensive knowledge of historical patterns of abuse in religious institutions, suggesting that Kaya's story fit within a larger framework of crimes that she had been tracking for years. The turning point in their telephone conversation came when Officer Yazi asked Kaya to describe Zola's stone bird in detail. His description of the carving's traditional Navajo craftsmanship, its spiritual significance within his family's cultural tradition, and its role as a protective talisman that his father had created with his own hands, seemed to resonate with something deep within the officer's understanding. Her voice softened perceptibly as she acknowledged the sacred nature of the object and the profound violation represented by its abandonment in a place of institutional horror. What followed was a moment of connection that transcended the official nature of their communication, as Officer Yazi shared her own understanding of the cultural significance of traditional crafts and their role in maintaining connections between Native families scattered by institutional policies designed to destroy tribal bonds. She spoke of her own investigations into missing children cases, describing patterns of abuse and neglect that had continued long after the official closure of government boarding schools, but which had simply adapted to new forms and new institutional covers. The officer's response to Kaya's evidence was immediate and decisive, Rather than expressing the skepticism or jurisdictional concerns that might have characterized responses from other law enforcement agencies, she demonstrated both personal understanding of the historical context and professional determination to pursue justice regardless of the obstacles involved. Her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence to support investigations that had been frustrated by lack of physical proof and witness testimony. Officer Yazie's commitment to their cause became apparent as she began outlining the resources that tribal law enforcement could bring to bear on their investigation. The Navajo Nation Police possessed not only jurisdictional authority over crimes involving tribal members, but also federal connections through the Bureau of Indian Affairs that could bypass the local corruption they had encountered. More importantly, tribal law enforcement operated within a cultural framework that understood the significance of crimes against children and families, making it far more likely that their evidence would receive serious consideration rather than bureaucratic dismissal. The conversation concluded with Officer Yazie providing specific instructions for a covert meeting that would allow them to transfer their evidence safely while avoiding the local authorities who had threatened them with arrest. Her tactical planning revealed extensive experience in dealing with situations where local corruption had compromised traditional law enforcement channels, suggesting that their case was not unique, but part of a larger pattern of institutional failure that required alternative approaches to achieve justice. As Kaya hung up the telephone, he felt a transformation in his emotional state that was almost spiritual in its intensity. For 20 years, he had carried the burden of his sister's disappearance as a solitary weight that had isolated him from normal human connection and meaningful relationships. The knowledge that Officer Yazie not only believed his account, but possessed the authority and determination to act upon it, represented the first real hope he had experienced since receiving the anonymous letter that had started this final chapter of his investigation. Liam watched Kaya's face in the flickering light of the phone booth, seeing decades of accumulated desperation transform into something approaching peace, as the burden of solitary investigation was finally shared with someone who possessed both the power and the will to seek justice. The historian realized that he was witnessing a moment of profound significance, not just for Kaya personally, but for the broader struggle between institutional power and individual truth that had characterized American history since its inception. Walking back toward their hiding place behind the abandoned gas station, both men felt the weight of their circumstances shift from desperate isolation to purposeful alliance. They were no longer alone in their pursuit of truth, no longer dependent upon corrupt local authorities for validation of their evidence. The Navajo Nation Police represented not just law enforcement, but cultural understanding. Not just professional duty, but personal commitment to protecting children who had been failed by every other institution that should have served as their shield against predatory adults. The desert night that had seemed so threatening just hours earlier now felt protective rather than hostile, its vast darkness providing cover for their movement toward justice rather than concealment from inevitable capture. The stars that had witnessed 20 years of institutional silence now seemed to shine with the promise of truth, finally emerging into the light, carried forward by voices that would not be silenced and evidence that would not be buried. The dawn mist clung to the rolling hills surrounding Reverend Alistair Cole's sprawling estate like a shroud concealing decades of buried sins. Officer Teha Yazie crouched behind a weathered boulder at the perimeter of the property, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air as she surveyed the compound through high-powered binoculars. The estate stretched across nearly 200 acres of prime New Mexico landscape, its manicured grounds and imposing architecture serving as monuments to wealth accumulated through the systematic exploitation of society's most vulnerable children. The main house rose from the desert like a fortress of respectability, its adobe walls painted pristine white and adorned with religious symbols that proclaimed the owner's devotion to Christian values. Wrought iron gates bearing crosses and biblical verses protected the circular driveway, while security cameras mounted on ornate lampposts monitored every approach with mechanical vigilance. The entire compound radiated an aura of sanctified prosperity that would have impressed visitors unaware of the blood money that had funded its construction and maintenance. Behind Officer Yazie, a team of 12 Navajo Nation police officers prepared their equipment with the methodical precision of warriors embarking on a sacred mission. Each officer had been personally selected for this operation based not only on their tactical skills, but on their understanding of the cultural significance of their mission. These were men and women who had grown up hearing stories of children stolen from their families by institutional predators. Officers whose own relatives had survived the boarding school system and its systematic attempts to destroy native identity and family bonds. The evidence that Kaya and Liam had provided had triggered a federal investigation that bypassed local corruption through direct coordination between tribal authorities and the FBI's unit specializing in crimes against children. Agent Sarah Matthews, a 20-year veteran of child trafficking cases, had reviewed Sister Margaret's diary and supporting documentation with the grim efficiency of someone who had seen too many examples of institutional evil disguised as charitable work. Her preliminary investigation had uncovered financial records, property transfers, and communication patterns that painted a picture of criminal enterprise spanning multiple states and involving dozens of complicit individuals. The tactical plan for the raid had been developed through careful surveillance and intelligence gathering that revealed the compound's security weaknesses while minimizing risks to any children who might still be held on the property. Thermal imaging had detected multiple heat signatures in various buildings, suggesting a larger population than would be expected for a private residence. Ground-penetrating radar had identified underground structures that might serve purposes similar to the hidden chambers discovered beneath St. Jude's bell tower. Every piece of intelligence pointed toward ongoing criminal activity that demanded immediate intervention. Officer Yazzie checked her watch as the designated time for the operation approached, feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that preceded high-stakes law enforcement actions. This was more than a routine raid for her. It was a reckoning with historical injustices that had been ignored or covered up for too long. The faces of missing Native children whose cases had been dismissed or forgotten by mainstream authorities seemed to hover in the morning mist, demanding justice that had been delayed but not denied. The first phase of the operation began with the systematic neutralization of the compound's security systems, accomplished by FBI technical specialists who had been monitoring the property's electronic communications for weeks. Cameras went dark, motion sensors fell silent, and electronic locks disengaged as the tactical team moved through the perimeter with ghost-like precision. The estate's isolation, which had protected its criminal activities for years, now worked against its defenders, as help from local authorities would be too distant to affect the operation's outcome. Kaya waited in an unmarked vehicle positioned on a hill overlooking the compound, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity as he watched the tactical teams deploy across the property. 20 years of obsessive searching had led to this moment when the truth would finally confront the lies that had protected his sister's tormentors. The stone bird rested in his shirt pocket, its familiar weight serving as both anchor to the past and talisman for the justice that was finally within reach. The main assault began with simultaneous breaches at 3 separate entry points, designed to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of suspects. Officer Yazzie led the primary team through the front entrance, her weapon drawn and senses hyper-alert as they moved through corridors lined with religious artwork that seemed to mock the sacrilege that had been committed within these walls. The house's interior was a study in contradictions, combining ostentatious displays of wealth with religious iconography that should have inspired humility and service, rather than enabling exploitation and abuse. The search teams moved with practiced efficiency through the mansion's numerous rooms, their tactical lights cutting through shadows that had concealed decades of criminal activity. Document storage rooms yielded filing cabinets filled with records that would take investigators months to fully analyze. But initial examination revealed evidence of the systematic processing of children through networks that spanned multiple states and involved hundreds of transactions. Names, ages, photographs, and financial records painted a picture of human trafficking disguised as legitimate adoption services. In the basement of the main house, investigators discovered facilities that bore disturbing similarities to the underground chambers beneath St. Jude's bell tower. Stone-walled rooms equipped with restraints, monitoring equipment, and what appeared to be ceremonial furnishings suggested activities that combined commercial exploitation with ritualistic abuse, designed to break children's spirits and eliminate their resistance to placement with buyers who had specific requirements for compliance and submission. The breakthrough came when Officer Yazzie's team located a separate residential building hidden behind the main house, camouflaged by landscaping and positioned to be invisible from public roads or aerial surveillance. The structure appeared to be a dormitory or housing facility, its windows barred and its entrances secured with locks that could only be opened from the outside. Thermal imaging confirmed the presence of multiple individuals within the building. their heat signatures suggesting both adults and children in various states of distress or confinement. The entry into the hidden dormitory revealed a scene that validated every suspicion and exceeded every nightmare that the investigators had prepared themselves to encounter. Young people of various ages and ethnicities filled the rooms, their faces bearing the hollow expressions of individuals whose spirits had been systematically broken through prolonged psychological manipulation and physical control. Some appeared to be recent arrivals, still showing signs of resistance and hope, while others displayed the vacant compliance that characterized long-term victims of institutional abuse. Among the residents, Officer Yazzi's trained eye identified two young women, whose facial features and bone structure suggested Native American heritage, despite years of institutional attempts to erase their cultural identity. The women appeared to be in their 20s, their dark hair cut short in styles that eliminated any resemblance to traditional Navajo appearance, their clothing consisting of identical gray uniforms that stripped away individual expression. Their eyes held the guarded wariness of survivors who had learned that hope was a luxury that led only to deeper disappointment. As the rescue operation proceeded with the careful precision necessary to avoid traumatizing victims who had already endured years of systematic abuse, Agent Matthews coordinated the collection of evidence that would support prosecutions extending far beyond Reverend Cole's immediate criminal enterprise. Computer hard drives, financial records, correspondence, and photographic evidence revealed connections to adoption agencies, religious organizations, government officials, and wealthy individuals who had participated in or benefited from the trafficking network. The arrest of Reverend Alistair Cole himself took place in his private study, a room lined with religious texts and decorated with awards recognizing his supposed contributions to child welfare and Christian charity. The 70-year-old man who emerged from behind an ornate wooden desk bore little resemblance to the charismatic figure who had posed with Navajo children in photographs taken 20 years earlier. Age and decades of hidden guilt had transformed him into a wizened figure whose eyes held the calculating coldness of a predator who had never felt genuine remorse for his crimes. Cole's arrest was conducted with the formal dignity appropriate to the magnitude of his crimes, Agent Matthews reading the charges in a voice that carried 20 years of accumulated authority and determination. Human trafficking, conspiracy, fraud, kidnapping, and numerous other federal charges would ensure that the remainder of his life would be spent in federal prison, paying a price that was decades overdue, but no less satisfying for its delay. The identification of Kiona and Anya among the rescued victims required careful verification through dental records, DNA analysis, and painstaking comparison with childhood photographs that Kaya had preserved through 20 years of searching. The women who had once been his beloved younger sisters bore little physical resemblance to the children who had disappeared from St. Jude's, their appearances altered by time, trauma, and deliberate attempts to erase their original identities through medical and cosmetic procedures that had changed even their facial bone structure. The reunion took place in a secure medical facility where the rescued victims were receiving initial treatment for the physical and psychological trauma they had endured during their years of captivity. Kaya approached the meeting room where his sisters waited with steps that felt both eager and terrified, knowing that the children he remembered might no longer exist within the damaged adults they had become. The door handle felt cold beneath his palm as he paused to steel himself for an encounter that would either fulfill his deepest hopes or shatter his most cherished memories. Kiona and Anya sat together on a hospital sofa, their hands clasped with the desperate grip of siblings who had learned to depend entirely upon each other for survival in a world that had tried to erase their very existence. Their eyes held the wariness of wild animals encountering potential threats, decades of conditioning having taught them that strangers represented danger rather than salvation. The institutional clothing they wore hung loosely on frames that spoke of inadequate nutrition and medical neglect, while their posture suggested the hypervigilance of individuals who had learned that relaxation invited punishment. The moment of recognition was gradual rather than immediate, filtered through layers of trauma and altered identity that had to be carefully penetrated before family bonds could reassert themselves. Kaya approached slowly, his hands visible and his voice soft as he spoke their childhood names and shared memories that only family members could possess. The spark of recognition that eventually flickered in their eyes was followed by tears that seemed to wash away years of suppressed emotion and artificial identity. Officer Yazzie watched from the doorway as 20 years of separation dissolved into an embrace that transcended the physical and psychological damage that had been inflicted upon all three siblings. Kaya's weathered face was streaked with tears of joy and relief as he held his sisters close, feeling their hearts beating against his chest and confirming that they were real rather than figments of desperate imagination. The stone bird pressed between them served as a tangible connection to the family they had once been, and the cultural identity that had survived despite systematic attempts at erasure. The medical debriefing that followed the reunion revealed the full extent of the trauma that Kiona and Anya had endured during their years of captivity. They had been subjected to systematic psychological manipulation designed to erase their memories of family and cultural identity, combined with medical procedures that had altered their appearances to make them more appealing to potential buyers in the illegal adoption market. Their education had been limited to skills that would make them useful as domestic servants or companions to wealthy individuals who valued compliance over intelligence or creativity. Most heartbreaking was the information they provided about Zola, whose fierce resistance to the trafficking network's attempts at control had ultimately led to her death during the early years of their captivity. According to their testimony, the eldest sister had never stopped fighting to protect her younger siblings and maintain their connection to their Navajo heritage, even when such resistance brought increasingly severe punishment from their captors. Her death had occurred during a failed escape attempt that had been motivated entirely by her determination to return Kiona and Anya to their family and community. The stone bird that had provided the crucial evidence linking the sisters to St. Jude's underground chambers had been Zola's final gift to her siblings, passed to them during her last moments with instructions to hold on to their identity, no matter what their captors did to change their appearance or memories. The carving had served as a secret talisman throughout their years of captivity, hidden from their captors, but treasured as proof that they had once belonged to a family that loved them and a culture that valued their existence beyond their utility to others. As the sun set over the New Mexico landscape, casting long shadows across the compound where so much evil had been concealed behind facades of respectability and religious devotion, Kaya stood with his surviving sisters and felt the weight of 20 years begin to lift from his shoulders. The stone bird rested in his palm, no longer evidence of loss but proof of love that had survived separation, trauma, and systematic attempts at destruction. His quest had ended not with the answers he had originally sought, but with something far more precious: the knowledge that family bonds could survive even the most determined attempts to break them, and that justice, however delayed, was still possible for those who refused to surrender hope. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.